Welcome back to our channel World of Royals.
Imagine this for a moment. What if your entire life, every photo, every interview, and every relationship was carefully shaped to tell one perfect story? A story of success, of transformation, of rising from an ordinary life into global fame. Now imagine that within that perfect story, there is one hidden detail. Just one secret from the past that has the power to destroy everything that came after it. For years, the world has seen Meghan Markle as a symbol of reinvention. An actress who became a duchess. A modern figure inside one of the oldest institutions in the world. From the outside, the story looks complete, controlled, and carefully presented. But behind that image, there have always been whispers. Quiet questions that never fully disappeared, only faded into the background. Now, those whispers are getting louder. And at the center of it all is a claim so serious that it changes the entire narrative. A claim that long before the royal wedding, before Hollywood success, and before global recognition, Meghan Markle may have made a decision that was never meant to be public. A decision connected to a child she allegedly had at the age of 19. This is not being treated as simple gossip. It is being discussed as something much deeper. A story about ambition, difficult choices, and a past that refuses to stay hidden. What makes this even more significant is where the claim is coming from. This is not a distant voice or an anonymous source. It is her father, Thomas Markle, a man who knew her before the cameras, before the titles, and before the world was watching. When he spoke recently, his tone was different. It didn't sound like anger or another public dispute. It felt heavier. More final, like someone who has carried something for too long and can no longer keep it inside. He described a version of the past that does not match the public image. A hidden chapter that, according to him, has been buried for decades. If what he is saying is even partially true, then there is a missing piece in everything we have been told. That missing piece is a daughter. A child who, according to these claims, was never part of the story. Never acknowledged, never introduced, never explained. A life that existed, but remained completely outside the narrative. This raises an important question. How does something like this stay hidden for so long? Because a secret of this scale does not just disappear. It requires control, management, and above all, silence. To understand that, you have to look at Thomas Markle himself. He was not just a distant parent. He was deeply involved in her early life. An Emmy-winning lighting director who understood image, storytelling, and perception. He supported her education, encouraged her ambitions, and helped create the path she followed. For years, he was not only a father, but also a protector. Someone who shielded mistakes and kept certain things from becoming public. But now, he seems to see that differently. Not as protection, but as silence. And that silence may have allowed something much bigger to remain hidden. According to these claims, the story goes back to the late 1990s. A young student, still building her life, suddenly facing a situation that could change everything. An unexpected pregnancy. A moment where any decision would shape the future. What is being suggested is not just that a child was born, but that a decision was made afterward. A decision that allowed life to continue forward without interruption, but left something behind. From that point on, the story the world knows begins. Career growth, new opportunities, and a carefully built public image. But if this hidden chapter exists, then everything that followed may have been built on top of something that was never addressed. Which brings us back to the same question. If this secret was real, how was it kept hidden for more than 20 years? Because secrets do not stay buried on their own. They are controlled, managed, and sometimes completely erased. And in the next part, we go deeper into where this may have started, who else may have been involved, and the connection that could change everything. If a secret like this really existed, then the next question becomes unavoidable. How was it kept hidden for so long? Because something this serious doesn't just disappear. It requires control, coordination, and most importantly, silence from everyone involved. To understand how that might have been possible, we have to go back to where it all allegedly began. The late 1990s. Northwestern University. A time when everything was still forming, identity, ambition, direction. On the surface, it looked like a normal college life. A young woman studying theater and international relations, surrounded by opportunity. But according to the claims now resurfacing, this period may have been far more complicated than it seemed. It was during this time that another name enters the story, Joseph Giuliano. Not a public figure, not someone who has spoken openly, but someone whose presence has quietly remained in the background for years. To most people, this would have looked like a typical college relationship. But those who have followed this story closely believe it may have been something more serious. There are claims that the relationship escalated quickly. What started as a connection soon became something deeper. In some versions of the story, it didn't just remain a relationship, it became a marriage. Not public, not celebrated, but quiet and hidden. Something that took place away from attention, with very few people aware of it. If that sounds extreme, the next detail makes it even more difficult to ignore. Because according to these claims, the relationship didn't last long. It ended almost as quickly as it began. But it didn't end in the usual way. Instead of a standard divorce, there are suggestions that an annulment was pursued. And that detail matters. An annulment doesn't just end a marriage, it erases it. Legally, it declares that the marriage never existed. It removes the record and clears the path forward. For someone trying to move ahead without complications, it would be the most effective way to start fresh. But here's the problem. While a marriage can be erased on paper, a child cannot. And this is where the timeline becomes difficult to ignore. Because if these claims are accurate, then everything, the relationship, the marriage, and the annulment, was happening at the same time a child entered the picture. That overlap changes everything. It suggests that what was being resolved legally may not have been the only issue. It raises the possibility that decisions were being made not just about a relationship, but about a life that had just begun. According to the theory being discussed, what followed was not random. It was structured. The relationship ends, the legal record disappears, and the child is placed somewhere far from the public eye. Not abandoned in a simple sense, but removed from the narrative completely, hidden from view. And if that's true, it explains something that has confused many people for years, why there are so few traces of this period in the official story. Because when you look back at the timeline, everything appears smooth. Clean transitions, no complications, no visible connections to anything unresolved. But real life rarely works that way, which is why people started asking questions. And when they did, they began to find small digital traces, archived pages, old social media activity, and fragments that didn't fully match the official narrative. One of the most talked about examples involves a social media account allegedly connected to the Giuliano family. At one point, it featured a photo that caught attention and led people to start comparing timelines and details. For some, it meant nothing, just coincidence. But for others, it felt like the first real clue. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it disappeared. The image was removed, the account changed, and the trace was cleaned. To some, that proved nothing. But to others, it raised a bigger question. Why remove something unless it mattered? This is where the idea of a controlled past begins to take shape. Not just moving on, but actively managing what remains visible and what disappears. Because even in a digital world, things can be deleted, but they often leave behind traces. And those traces are what keep the questions alive. Because even with all of this, one question still remains. If this past existed, how is it kept hidden not just from the public, but from the people closest to her later in life? And in the next part, we step back and look at the bigger picture. The relationships, the timing, and the pattern that starts to emerge. Up to this point, everything can still be seen as separate pieces. A claim here, a rumor there, a few details that may or may not connect. On their own, they can be dismissed. But the moment you step back and look at everything together, something begins to feel different. Because this no longer looks like one isolated story. It starts to look like a pattern. And patterns are much harder to ignore. To understand this, you have to stop focusing on one moment and start looking at the full timeline. The relationships, the transitions, and the way each phase of life begins and ends. When you do that, certain similarities begin to stand out. Let's go back to the earliest connection being discussed, Joseph Giuliano. If the claims are accurate, this wasn't just a simple college relationship. It may have been something deeper, possibly involving commitment and consequences that were never made public. But what stands out most is not how it began, but how it ended. Quickly, quietly, and completely erased. No visible connection carried forward. No trace that linked that chapter to what came next. Then comes the next phase, Trevor Engelson. This time, everything appears more stable and public. A relationship connected to Hollywood, to opportunity, and to career growth. During this period, things begin to change. Visibility increases, opportunities expand, and eventually, a breakthrough moment arrives. But once again, the ending follows a similar pattern. Sudden, clean, and without the kind of gradual transition most people expect. The relationship ends, and just like before, there is no overlap with what follows. And then comes the next shift. Prince Harry. Now, everything moves to an entirely different level. This is no longer just about career. It becomes global, institutional, and highly visible. The scale is bigger, the attention is stronger, and the stakes are higher than ever before. But even here, something feels familiar. A fast connection, a powerful narrative, a story that captures global attention almost instantly. When you line these phases up side by side, a question begins to form. Why does each stage seem to connect so closely with a specific level of progression? First, access to elite social circles. Then, access to Hollywood. And finally, access to global influence. 3 different worlds, each entered at a very specific moment. On its own, this could be coincidence. People grow, they meet new people, they move forward. That is normal. But what makes this different is the consistency. Each phase aligns with the next step, and once that step is taken, the previous one disappears completely. No overlap, no revisiting, no visible ties left behind. Which brings us back to the earlier claim, the hidden past, the alleged child, the erased timeline. Because if a pattern like this exists, then that first chapter no longer feels random. It starts to fit into the same structure, a complication that could not continue forward. A past that needed to be removed in order for the next phase to begin cleanly. And suddenly, what once seemed like a single rumor begins to look like the starting point of everything that followed. But patterns only hold as long as nothing interrupts them, as long as everything stays hidden, as long as no one speaks. And right now, that may be starting to change. Because more people are looking at the same timeline, asking the same questions, and noticing the same connections. And when enough people start seeing the same pattern, it becomes harder to dismiss. It starts demanding answers. And in the next part, we move into the most critical stage, when questions begin to turn into pressure, and pressure begins to demand proof. When a story reaches this stage, it stops being quiet. What begins as scattered claims slowly turns into something more organized, more focused, and much harder to ignore. The tone changes. The conversation shifts. And instead of people asking whether the story is interesting, they begin asking whether it could actually be true. For a long time, everything connected to this situation could be dismissed as speculation. Different voices, different claims, no clear proof linking them together. But now, what's being discussed feels different. It is no longer just about opinions or theories. It is about the possibility that there may be real material behind these claims. There are mentions of records, fragments of legal documents, and digital traces that people believe connect back to the same timeline. On their own, none of these pieces prove anything. But when they are viewed together, they begin to form a direction. A sense that all of this may be part of the same story rather than separate coincidences. One of the key ideas at this stage is that this information may not have appeared suddenly. Instead, it may have been collected over time. Small pieces gathered quietly, waiting for the right moment to surface. And timing is important, because information released too early disappears, but information released at the right moment spreads quickly and reaches a much larger audience. And right now, that spread is happening. Part of what makes this moment more serious is the shift towards something that feels more concrete. Not just interpretation, but the possibility of verification. The idea that this situation could move from speculation to something that can actually be proven. At the center of that idea is something simple: a DNA test. It sounds straightforward, but it carries enormous weight. Because if the claims are false, a test would end the story immediately. No more questions, no more debate. But if the claims are true, then the impact goes far beyond a single revelation. This is why the pressure is building. Because once the idea of proof enters the conversation, everything changes. Silence is no longer neutral. It begins to be interpreted. People start asking why there is no response, no clear denial, no attempt to close the discussion. And as those questions grow, the impact spreads beyond the story itself. It begins to affect perception, reputation, trust, not just on a personal level, but on a wider scale involving public image and professional relationships. Brands, partners, and collaborators do not wait for final answers. They respond to risk. And when something begins to feel uncertain, decisions start to shift quietly in the background. At the same time, there is still a human side to all of this. Behind the claims and the discussion are real people. A father who has spoken out. A young woman who, if the claims are true, has lived with unanswered questions for years. And a public figure whose story is now being examined more closely than ever before. As everything continues to build, one thing becomes clear. This situation is no longer something that can simply fade away. It has reached a point where it is moving forward on its own. And once that happens, it only leads in one direction, toward a final moment. Because in the next part, everything comes together. The response, the outcome, and the answer that will determine how this entire story is remembered. When a story reaches this point, everything becomes immediate. There is no more slow build, no more distance between the claim and the response. It all begins to come together into one moment where something has to happen. Because once the pressure reaches this level, it cannot stay there forever. It either breaks or it is resolved. What makes this stage different is the scale. This is no longer a discussion happening in small groups or limited spaces. It has grown into something much larger. Public attention is now focused, and every detail is being watched, discussed, and shared. When that happens, the story no longer stays controlled. It begins to move on its own. At the center of this moment is the idea of a direct reveal. Not just another interview or statement, but a situation where everything that has been building behind the scenes comes forward at once. Claims, timelines, and personal accounts all brought together in a way that demands a response. And that response is now unavoidable. Up until now, silence has been an option. It allowed distance and control. It allowed the situation to remain unclear. But at this stage, silence carries meaning. People begin to interpret it, question it, and connect it to everything else that has been said. There are only two possible directions from here. Either the story is addressed clearly and directly, or it continues to grow without limits. Responding means stepping into the center of the situation. It means confronting every claim and every question that has been building over time. It creates the opportunity to end the speculation, but it also brings more attention and makes everything more intense. Remaining silent does the opposite, but with its own consequences. It leaves space for interpretation and allows others to shape the narrative. Over time, that silence can begin to feel like confirmation in the eyes of the public. This is why this moment matters more than anything that came before. Because now, it is no longer about what may have happened in the past. It is about what happens next. At the center of everything is the same question that has been there from the beginning. Is it true? Because everything depends on that answer. If the claims are false, then this situation becomes an example of how quickly stories can grow without proof. But if the claims are true, then the impact changes everything. It reshapes not only public perception, but also personal relationships and trust. For Prince Harry, this moment carries a deeper weight. Because if even part of the story is real, it raises questions that go beyond public image. It becomes personal. It becomes about trust, about what was known, and what may have been hidden. And when trust is questioned, it affects everything. At the same time, there is another figure at the center of this story, the alleged daughter. No longer part of a distant past, but an adult who, if the claims are accurate, has lived with this reality her entire life. Her role is different from everyone else's, because if she exists, she represents something that cannot be explained away. She becomes the direct link between the past and the present. And that is why this story has reached this point. Because in the end, this is not just about image or reputation. It is about truth. And truth has a way of coming forward, no matter how long it has been hidden. As this situation continues, one thing is certain. This story will not simply disappear. It will move forward until it reaches an outcome. And when it does, it will not just close a chapter. It will redefine everything that came before it. Because some stories are not just told. They are revealed. And once revealed, they cannot be undone.